Welcome everybody, I'm John Wally, and we are continuing in our series for Tenable OT Security. This is our third episode, and today we're going to be covering how to walk through the wizard, do initial setups, and some of the lessons learned out there that it's really important to do some initial configurations as we jump in. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So we have gone to port 443 to our IP address that we covered in the previous episodes. So I'm going to my primary one, and now on 443 there is a setup wizard. In between sessions, between episode 2 and this episode 3, I did reboot the system. I recommend that you do that just to make sure some of our changes went into effect, like our host name and stuff like that, so we have no errors in the back end, make sure our DNS is working. That reboot will do that. So I went through a reboot, but other than that, nothing has changed between episodes. So let's jump in. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to start my setup wizard. I'm going to give it a username. Now this is different than the username that we created in Tenable Core. In Tenable Core, we created an admin user. What that really was for is on the admin side for Tenable Core, that's the operating system level. That's a low functioning, whoever's maintaining that system, patching that system, that sort of thing. The user that the wizard is looking for now is actually an application user. So I'm going to do something like OT admin so I know the difference in the users that I'm using here. And the reason I like to make this a different username than what I do in the back end is so that I know when I go through my policies of updating my passwords that I realize these are two separate accounts. One's for the application, one's for the operating system. And sometimes that'll help, like when we're going through that, to make sure that both of those are changing on a regular basis. Also in the future, while I'm here talking about passwords, I don't recommend doing things like admin or OT admin. We're doing that for lab purposes, but you really want to tie accounts, even if they're administrator accounts, to specific users. So one of the things that we'll get into later on in the configurations is how to take these generic accounts when we're setting things up, disabling those accounts and creating accounts that are very user-based. And then even further down the line, we'll talk about Active Directory integrations and stuff like that, where we can actually do that at an enterprise level. All right, so I'm going to put in a password here. It says that we need to have 12 characters, 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 digit, and 1 special character. We're going to hit next. And we want a device name. I typically try to make it a policy that I create my device name as the same thing that I created for my host name. What this does, if you have another product that Tenable puts out there as an enterprise manager for OT, this is what will show up. The actual DNS name won't show up, or the host name won't show up. This name will show up in the enterprise manager. And that's why I try to keep them the same. So if you're naming something by site, so you have multiple OT security appliances that you're rolling out across multiple sites in a worldwide deployment, you want to make sure that you know that it's your core device, but you also probably want to name it in a way so that you know what site it is. For us and lab purposes, we're just saying Tenable OT Core. The next thing I'll bring your attention to, remember we had 4 Ethernet ports. We had port 1 and port 2, 3, and 4. One of the things that you can do in Tenable OT is port 1, or NIC 0, is where we do queries and management. We haven't talked a lot about what are queries and what do they do, and we'll get into that later. But the idea is port 1 is how we're managing the interface, which is what we're doing right now, but it's also how we talk to other devices on the network. So we talk to PLCs, or we talk to engineering workstations, or we talk to jump boxes, whatever it is that's out there. Port 1's what sits on that industrial network so that we can actually poll and query devices that are out there. Now don't let that scare you, you're not scanning anything. We'll talk about the importance and the differences between active query later on and your typical environment where you're doing vulnerability scanning. And the second port is our mirror port. And so remember, we set up the second port when we went to ESXi, and we said, hey, we have two different networks. We have our local area network and we have our monitoring network. And here's where this mirror port comes in. So we have the capability, if we were to turn that on, to actually ingest mirrored traffic, or PCAPs, and capture PCAPs off of that in a passive way. The next thing we want to do is put in our IP address. Well, we already know our IP address, and this is something that's going to change in the future because we've already set up our IP address. Why is it asked for it again? And this is one of the things that were left over before Tenable bought this product. They came over from Indige, and it's just never changed. This will overwrite what's in Tenable Core if you ever wanted to change it. So if you were to go in and set up on the default IP, you could go directly to the wizard, go set this up, and that would work. For us, we're just going to enter the same one. Do our /24 network, our 255.255.255, and we're going to enter our gateway as well. For enable usage statistics, I'm going to turn that off. If you want to keep that on, you can. This just feeds information to Tenable about how you use the tool and how, if you have errors and that sort of stuff, it gets reported so that they can make the tool better. I'm paranoid, so I always turn this off for all products. And we're going to hit next. If you're on a smaller screen, this may be hidden below. You want to make sure that you scroll down so you get to it if you do not want that to be turned on, because it's turned on by default. All right, we're going to hit next. We're going to do a time zone. Now this really depends on how you want to set things up. If you're feeding your data to a SOC or a SIEM and you have the worldwide deployment, I recommend staying on ETC. However, if it's one and you have a local time zone that you're setting up, it doesn't hurt to set your local time zone as well. So it's really up to you and your division on how you do it. It makes it a little bit easier to read if it's local, and your timing stuff isn't messed up. But if you have a SIEM that's collecting logs for everywhere, sometimes it's easier to set it to UTC so that you can see all the events and how the timing works across all of those. So it's totally up to you. For me, since this is one deployment, I'm in Eastern time. So I'm going to go in and say US Eastern, and today is 3:15, and it is currently 10:50, not 2:50. And it's AM. And now we're set. So we have our date, our time, and everything. We're going to hit complete and restart. And this will take a few minutes to get through the restart. I'll speed this part of the video up as we go through, and I'll be back with you as soon as the system's back up. All right, so it looks like we're all set and ready to log in. So I'm going to go to my username, and we made this OT admin, and I'm going to log in for the first time. And it's going to take us to an activation or a license activation screen. I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you do this. So for customers that are currently with us, you're going to be able to go and log in to provisioning. So the address to that is provisioning.tenable.com. I've already pulled this up. So you have provisioning.tenable.com, and you're going to have all your products here with all your license codes. This can be a little tricky to navigate, and I'm gonna walk through this as best I can. I'm using a different kind of licensing for demoing just so that I can teach this. It's gonna work a little bit differently how I actually go through and activate. But the idea is if you go in, you can click on any product that you have, whether it's Security Center or Vulnerability Management or OT Security, and you say that you want to manage either your assets or your sites. In the case of OT security, we manage sites. So if I were to click on this, I'm going to come over here. You're going to have a list of codes, and all of these are going to be your individual license codes. You'll be able to click on that code. You'll go in, you grab the code, and you'll be able to either add sites, remove sites, and go through and use that code as many times as you want. So for an example, when you see the sites listed out to the far side, you'll say how many sites are licensed, when's the expiration date, and then you'll see also like how many are allowed. So you'll see in some of these, I have 0 of none, I have 1 of 1,000. And so you'll see how these different ones are laid out for each one of these. And so it'll tell you how many sites are allowed and how many IPs that you're allowed on each one, and so on and so forth. So you'll be able to click into one of these and it'll actually go through and you'll say, hey, I want to add a site, or I want to remove a site under actions. So if you use all your IPs on a single site, you'll have to remove that site before your license code will work again. Now I know we have a lot of stuff blurred out on this one so that you can't see them. That's because these are real license codes. Later on, you'll see me put one in that's a demo that's going to expire in a day. So I'm not too worried about people seeing those as we walk through that. But I wanted everybody to see how the provisioning site works. So if we go back to provisioning, you're going to go into your managed sites. Once you get to managed sites, you'll have your license code, and then you can go in and manage that site by clicking on it, by adding and removing sites and assigning how many IPs you want for each site. So you may have the ability, let's say you have 1,000 sites, you could have 500 IPs at one site and 500 IPs at another site. So you could stand up 2 complete sites, or you could have a single site with all 1,000 IPs. So that's how it's worked. But let's say you have one site with all 1,000, and then you decide you want to stand up a second site. What you'll have to do is remove the first site and then add 2 sites, each one for 500. I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but once you start clicking in here, that'll make some sense. All right, so I'm going to go back here, and the first thing I want to do is set up my license code. So I'm going to pull down my license code here, just so I can get started. So I'm going to go to license code. I'm going to enter my license code, and then I'm going to hit verify, and I'll get a verification. The next thing I want to do is generate a certificate. And so what happens on the certificate side is it gives me a fingerprint of this device. And Tenable needs to know what that fingerprint is, so that then they'll say it's activated, and I know specifically what device that I've activated against. So I'm going to go to generate a certificate. I'm going to copy this to my clipboard, and I'm going to hit done. The next thing I'm going to do is go to enter an activation. Now you'll automatically have an activation code, because what will happen is you go through and you add a site. You're going to go through a process similar to what you're going to see me do and mine, but it's going to look a little bit different. So when you add a site, it's going to ask you for that license key. It's going to ask you for your appliance certification code that we just copied, and then it's going to give you an activation code off of that. Now I'm going to do it a little bit different, but it works the same way because this is just a demo area. So I'm going to enter in my activation code. I'm going to enter in my license code. I'm going to say I understand and I've read, and I'm going to generate a code. You'll get a similar code like this inside of provisioning.tenable.com. You'll see it's here, just mine says it's offline. I'm going to copy that code. I'll go back here. I'm going to enter my activation code, and I'm going to select activate. So now you'll see the system was activated successfully. We are still in a standby mode, and you'll see here that it says that the system is disabled. The next thing we want to do is enable the system. If you're setting this up, a lot of times we recommend that you stage your equipment. So you go in, you do your activations, you get everything staged, you shut down, and then you go deploy it, rack, stack, and put it into your environment where you may be in an offline state. This is one of the reasons that this disabled is left here. So at this point, you could go in, I could log into port 8000, and I could do a shutdown of the system. So I could go here, I could log in as my admin, and I could do a safe shutdown of the system itself. So I could go in, say shutdown, I can pack everything up, go out into the plant, and install it if you're in that staging situation. So that's why we leave this off, so that we're not picking up data on a network that we don't want to see yet. For lab purposes, I'm going to go ahead and say enable. All right, we are good to go. We're logged in. We see we don't have any risk, any assets right now, nothing in our inventory. It looks like we're starting to pick up some inventory now. So we want to move pretty quickly. Now, one of the first things that you'll see with Tenable OT is that it'll start picking up anything and everything. And it's going to pick up a lot of stuff you really don't want. So pretty quickly, you're going to want to go to local settings. And we want to change some of our environmental settings from the very beginning. We're going to go to asset settings, and we're going to edit this monitored network. Right now, you'll see anything that's in the private address space, we're picking up, and we don't necessarily want to do that. So I'm going to edit this. I'm going to uncheck this, and then I'm only going to add the network that I care about. In this case, it would be my local area network. We'll change this later. And we're going to put the site or location in here. So we have our local area network, and I'm going to say save. And that'll keep us from picking up a bunch of licensed assets that we really aren't trying to use. So let me walk you through a little bit of what's going on here. What are we looking at? Now that we have our IP ranges, we've turned off picking up anything and everything, we can start talking about some of the dashboards and the events as far as how we're looking at Tenable OT and what it's showing us. There's other things that we need to set up, users and policies and tuning and a lot of stuff there. But in the very beginning, we're just going to kind of walk through what's in the dashboard itself. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, just for video purposes, a lot of times it's easier to see this in dark mode. So you can go into the regular mode, or you can go into dark mode. I'm going to go over, you'll see the little icon right here. I'm going to switch over to dark mode just to make it a little easier on the eyes. Now, the first thing you'll see is this statistics around risk. And so the risk comes in several different ways, and the way that Tenable actually measures risk is kind of unique to a lot of tools out there. Not only does it look at vulnerabilities, but it also looks at things like, am I mitigating those things? How many events do I have? Am I actually tracking and maintaining the system? Or am I just using it for reporting? Because the longer I let vulnerabilities sit out there, the longer I have events that aren't investigated, the higher the risk to the organization. So you'll see risk scores creep up the more and more that the tool sees. You'll have a basic inventory, and you'll see we're already learning. We have 14 assets on the network now, and you'll see them all identified as endpoints. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. All right. We have events and policies, and this will tell us if there's been any events on the network. Right now, we don't have any events. That's all right. One of the reasons we don't have any events is because we're not truly monitoring anything yet. We've seen some devices come in, but we're really only doing that because we're talking or seeing those devices. It's probably over broadcast, but we really don't have any monitoring going on right now because we turned the monitoring port off. We're going to turn those on later on, but for now, we're not too worried about it. Events are broken down into several things. You have all events, and we'll see we don't have any yet because we're not monitoring that. You have configuration events, SCADA events, network threats, and network events. It's probably easier to talk about these when we talk about policies. So policies drive events. And so if you think about it this way, this is the portion of the tool that's the intrusion detection system. We have policies that meet certain signatures or certain types of criteria that are out there that, if true, they generate an event. So there's things when we talk about controller activities, and let me reduce these a little bit because I want to talk about each one. So you have controller activities, and usually those are things around configuration, different types of things, whether it's validation or activities. Then you have network events, which is typically your regular kind of network monitoring stuff. Then you have network threats, which is typically malicious activities, and then you have SCADA events. So some of the things when we talk about controller activities are, there's a term of a code download, and you'll see a code download here. If you're not familiar with industrial control systems, when you see a code download, what that means is somebody's compiled new code and they're pushing it to a controller. I know that sounds a little backwards, and why isn't it called upload? It's because we're pushing that out to the controller. A lot of times that could be done over a serial port. It could be a local connection. It could be pushed over the wire, over IP. There's a lot of different ways that could happen, but one of the things that Tenable OT can see is if there is a configuration or controller activity. You'll see things like we've given a stop command to a PLC, a start command, or we can say, hey, there's been some kind of replacement for some IO card, or hey, somebody's changed or written a new tag to this device, or hey, there's been new firmware that's been pushed out there. So there's a lot of different things that we can see with controllers specifically, and it helps us identify areas where we may have problems or something malicious happens. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Stuxnet, and we've been talking about Stuxnet for years and years and years and years now. And it's because it was such a new type of weaponized malware that we haven't seen before touching our physical world. One of the ways that Stuxnet happened was because they went in and they changed the code on a controller and it lied to operators about what it was doing. Now with a tool like Tenable OT, and we talked about earlier in our first episode, why is it so important to protect critical infrastructure? One of the things that happened is started spinning these centrifuges to a point that was like random and erratic, and it was like breaking stuff, and it was causing explosions and all kinds of stuff in the Natanz plant, and it was actually lying back to the operators about what was happening. Today with something like this, we could see that somebody changed that code. We say, hey, there was an unauthorized change, somebody uploaded new code, and we would know about it. And not only could we know about it, we could actually see what actually changed in that code now. So that's a controller activity, one of the things that we're looking for. Then there's controller validation. Remember we said, hey, we can check on that code. Well, let's say we saw a code download. We can tell the system to go take a snapshot of whatever the logic is that's on that controller. If there's logic on that controller that's not baseline or not approved, we can get a snapshot mismatch where it says, hey, there's a configuration problem on that controller where something's out of sync. Or, hey, somebody updated firmware and we didn't know about it. And so there's another thing out there. Or we could say, hey, somebody just put this controller into edit mode or configuration mode. Or, hey, we have a fault on this controller. Or even things like where you have a key switch where you have to go into edit mode, it'll tell you when that switch has been turned manually. So there's all these different ways out there. If somebody plugs in a module on the back plane, or if somebody's removed a module from the back plane, we would know about it. So those are controller activities. Then you have network events. And these are the typical things that you can say that are out there, like, hey, we see something talking across a network that was not supposed to. Or we're seeing unencrypted passwords or FTP or telnet kind of things going on. Or we're seeing SMB communication from point A to point B that could possibly be compromised. SMB is a big one, right? Especially with all the eternal blue stuff. And a lot of these systems haven't been touched because we haven't really had an inventory before. So there's all these different areas that you kind of think of in typical networks on the IT side. You kind of see the same things, like, hey, we have certain open ports that shouldn't maybe be out there, or there's unauthorized communications, or we have IP conflicts. So you can think of these as all your basic network stuff that you're kind of used to seeing, but it does go a little bit deeper. It goes into some of the industrial protocols as well. Then we have network threats. Your network threats are actually true signatures out there for your intrusion detection. They're a little bit harder to edit if you ever wanted to change these, but they're like very specific types of attack, like Spectre or Heartbleed. You also look for things like ARP scans or SYN scans. If somebody's trying to do some kind of like Nmap or Nessus scan on your network, you're going to want to know about that. You have things like Black Energy out there. There's even one we talked about a few minutes ago about Stuxnet, looking for Stuxnet that's out there. So these are very, very specific things that we're looking for, even things like ransomware that are possibly on the network. So these are your network threats. And then finally, you have SCADA events. And these are things where, not to get too deep in the industrial control systems, but let's say that I send a function code to a device that's an illegal occurrence or an illegal exception. And so we were able to pick that up because a lot of times that could be some kind of attack where we're trying to send a function code to something that doesn't exist. And we don't know how the controller is going to respond to that. So we track those kind of things. Same thing for each kinds of control protocols that are out there, whether it's DMP3, you'll see different ones that are out there where we're actually managing those. That's a big one if you're using Modbus or IAC 6870. So each one of these, depending on what your environment's like, you would turn on or off based on those SCADA events. And you could start picking up things as well, like, hey, we have clock changes or illegal data or start and stops that we didn't expect, that kind of stuff. So all of these drive into our events then. If we were to go all events, you'll start seeing this. And we already have one that came in that said, hey, we have unauthorized conversations. We have something talking out of the 10.2.9 network out to an illegal destination. You'll see it's over NTP. All right. Inventory is broken down into 4 main areas. I know there's only 3 here that we're seeing. But if you look, we have all assets. So the way that Tenable OT learns is it basically sees the first time it sees anything, it sees it as an endpoint. And so as it learns, we don't want to change these names because it'll learn more the more it talks. Now, because we're not doing any real monitoring, this is just picking this up locally off of our port 1. We're not doing any passive monitoring right now. So we're not going to learn a whole lot about this, and we're not doing anything active either. So these are kind of stay this way right now, but it will give us a little bit of information. So if I click on one of these, right now it's not giving me much, but I can do things like, is there an IP trail? What are the attack vectors? What ports are open? What vulnerabilities are associated? Is there any events on this? And you'll see there is. I can even do something like pulling up a network map. Now, because we don't have a lot of data yet in our lab, we will. This hasn't generated a lot of data, and we actually changed our assets down under the environmental settings to make sure that we're not collecting a lot of bad data. So let me talk about inventory, and we're going to kind of wrap up here. I know there's a lot more to cover here, and we'll get into that in the future ones, but I wanted you to at least understand events and inventory. So we have all assets, then we have controllers and modules. Controllers and modules are tied only to things that are basically industrial control systems. So you can think of those like RTUs and MTUs and PLCs and those types of things. Where network assets are actually workstations, firewalls, switches, routers. So it's more than just network assets. I would say these are all your OT assets and these are all your IT assets. And I know that Tenable doesn't name them that way, but that's basically the idea. You have one other area that's not showing up here, and that is IoT assets. And those things are like smart light bulbs and printers and stuff like that. So one last area I'll talk about, and I wasn't sure I was going to do this, we'll talk about vulnerabilities. And even though there's nothing in here yet, one of the things that you'll see under vulnerabilities is this Nessus plugin set. I don't want you to confuse that with the Nessus scan. Tenable uses Nessus to parse plugins. And so the plugins for Tenable OT are in the 500,000 range. They basically go from 500,000 to 599,000. And so all of those plugins are tied specifically for OT assets or in the OT environment. So there's, as the vulnerabilities come in, if we start seeing, oh, this asset is a Rockwell and it's a ControlLogix and it has this firmware version, and then it can start saying, okay, there's CVEs related with that firmware on that device, and this will start filling in. All right, so that's a lot of information, and we've gone a long ways today. We've talked about activations. We went through the setup wizard. We got our system up and running. We did our initial configurations under our environmental configurations to make sure we don't get a lot of garbage, and we've covered our dashboards, events, policies, and inventory, and we did a light touch on vulnerabilities. If you have any questions, please post in the comments below. Until the next time we talk, have a great day.